Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be going on a journey into the world of political economy. We've got excerpts from Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos,
Yeah,
a book that really gets you thinking about the connection between politics and economics
right.
and how that shapes society.
Absolutely. It's about understanding how these forces influence not just policies, but also the way we view ourselves in the world around us.
Yeah. People often throw around the term neoliberalism,
hmm
but I think Brown does a great job of really defining it.
hmm
And it's so much more than just free markets.
Exactly. Brown goes beyond the surface and argues that neoliberalism is a governing rationality. It's almost like an underlying code that's been spreading for decades, influencing everything from government policy to our personal values.
So it's not just about economics, it's about how economic thinking has seeped into all areas of life.
That's the crux of it. Brown says it transforms us into Homo economicus beings who are constantly calculating, always striving for maximum personal gain in every interaction.
Hmm. That makes me think of how we often hear people say things like, what's the ROI on that?
Right.
Even when talking about relationships or personal experiences,
Mm-hmm.
it's like we're applying a spreadsheet to our whole lives.
That's a perfect example of how this logic plays out in everyday life. And Brown argues that this has some pretty significant consequences for society as a whole.
Okay, so walk me through some of those consequences. What are some of the big issues Brown sees with neoliberalism?
Well, she outlines 5 major negative effects.
Okay.
And I think they're all interconnected in a really fascinating way. The first is the intensification of inequality.
That one seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah,
The rich get richer, the poor get poor.
right. But Brown's point is that neoliberalism actually exacerbates this trend. Policies that prioritize deregulation and market competition often end up benefiting those who are already at the top,
Uh-huh.
while making it harder for everyone else to get ahead.
I see. It's not just about the existence of inequality, but about the systems that actively amplify it.
Right.
What's the second effect?
It's what Brown calls crass commodification.
Okay.
It's the idea that everything, even things that were traditionally considered outside the realm of market exchange,
Mhm.
become something to be bought and sold.
Like what? Give me a real-world example.
Think about healthcare. In a neoliberal framework, healthcare is increasingly seen as a product to be consumed,
Correct.
rather than a fundamental right.
Right.
This shift in thinking impacts everything from insurance policies to the doctor-patient relationship.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how these effects build on each other.
Hmm.
We go from valuing individual gain above all else to seeing everything as a transaction.
Right.
What's next on the list?
The third effect is corporate influence in government. As companies gain more economic power, they also gain more political clout.
Yeah.
And Brown argues they use that clout to shape policies in their favor, often at the expense of the public good.
I feel like we see this all the time, especially with lobbying efforts and campaign finance. Does Brown give any specific examples of this in action?
She does. One example she uses is Bremer Order 81 in Iraq. After the U.S. invasion, this order essentially outlawed Iraqi farmers from saving seeds,
Wow.
a practice that had been going on for centuries. They were then forced to buy seeds from multinational corporations.
Wow, so a whole agricultural system was completely upended to benefit corporate interests. It's a pretty stark illustration of how economic power can translate into real-world consequences.
Exactly. And this leads us to the fourth effect. Economic havoc. Brown argues that when economic growth is prioritized above all else, it can lead to instability, crises,
Right.
and ultimately harm to ordinary people.
That makes sense. A system built solely on profit might not be so sustainable in the long run.
Right.
And the fifth effect.
This one is really at the heart of Brown's argument. It's the erosion of the public good and the idea of citizenship itself.
So this connects back to that idea of Homo economicus always looking out for themselves.
Exactly. Brown argues that when we're constantly focused on our own individual economic gain, we lose sight of our shared responsibility for the common good. And when that happens, the very foundation of democracy starts to crumble.
It's like that saying, there's no such thing as society, only individuals and families.
That's actually a quote from Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, wow.
And Brown uses it to illustrate this tension between individual freedom and the idea of a collective good.
I'm already feeling like this deep dive's giving me a whole new perspective on things.
It's definitely challenging, but I think that's the beauty of Brown's work. It forces us to ask some really tough questions about the systems we live in and the values that drive them.
So we've got these 5 effects of neoliberalism, and they all seem pretty intertwined.
Hmm.
But I'm wondering, does Brown offer any solutions? Is there a way out of this?
That's where things get even more interesting. We'll dig into that and more after a quick word from our sponsors.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos. Before the break, we were discussing the 5 major effects of neoliberalism Brown outlines.
Right.
And it seems like they really paint a bleak picture.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to process.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly separate issues like economic inequality and the erosion of democracy
Right.
are actually deeply connected.
That's one of the most insightful aspects of Brown's work. She helps us see the bigger picture, the underlying systems that are shaping our world in often invisible ways.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that Brown also talks about how the concept of citizenship itself is transformed under neoliberalism. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. Brown argues that as we become more and more like Homo economicus, these self-interested economic actors,
Right.
our sense of civic duty and shared responsibility starts to fade away.
So instead of being active participants in shaping our society, we become more like customers of the state, just looking for the best deal for ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. And this shift has some pretty profound implications for how democracy functions.
Yeah, because if we're all just focused on our own individual needs and wants, how can we possibly come together to address collective challenges?
That's the core of Brown's argument. She's saying that neoliberalism undermines the very foundation of democracy, the idea of a demos, a collective body capable of exercising political sovereignty.
It makes me think about how voter turnout has been declining in many democracies around the world. Could this be part of the reason? People feeling disillusioned, disconnected from the political process?
Brown would argue that it's not just about apathy or disengagement. It's about a fundamental shift in how we understand our role as citizens. We're no longer seen as active participants in shaping our society, but rather as consumers of government services.
It's like we've gone from being citizens to clients.
Exactly. And that shift in mindset has consequences for how we think about rights responsibilities and the role of government itself.
So it's not just about individuals becoming more selfish, it's about the systems themselves being reshaped by this logic.
Precisely. Brown argues that even government institutions and processes start to operate according to market principles. She calls this the economization of the political sphere.
Can you give me a concrete example of how that plays out in the real world?
One example Brown discusses is the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in the U.S. This ruling essentially equated money with political speech, opening the floodgates for corporate spending in elections.
Right. I remember that being a really controversial decision.
Hmm.
How does Brown connect this to the economization of politics?
She argues that this decision exemplifies how neoliberal thinking has infiltrated our legal system by saying that corporations have the same free speech rights as individuals,
Right.
and that money is a form of speech. The court basically reinforced the idea that political influence is a commodity that can be bought and sold.
So it's not just about freedom of speech anymore. It's
Right.
about who has the deepest pockets and can amplify their voice the loudest.
Exactly. And this creates a system where the wealthy and powerful have a disproportionate influence on the political process,
Right.
further marginalizing ordinary citizens.
It's like the marketplace of ideas has literally become a marketplace.
That's a great analogy. And Brown argues that this trend has dire consequences for the future of democracy. When money dictates political outcomes, it undermines the very principle of one person, one vote.
Yeah, it's making me think about all those issues we discussed earlier, like inequality and the erosion of the public good. It seems like they're all interconnected.
They are. And that's why Brown's work is so important. It helps us see the connections between these seemingly disparate issues and understand the underlying forces that are shaping our world.
So far, we've been focusing on the political and economic dimensions of neoliberalism.
Right.
But I know Brown also explores the psychological effects. It's one thing to talk about systems,
Yeah.
but how does this all play out on an individual level?
That's a crucial aspect of Brown's analysis, and we'll delve into that right after this short break.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our exploration of Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos.
As we've seen, neoliberalism isn't just a set of economic policies. It's a profound shift in thinking that impacts every facet of our lives, from politics and economics to our very sense of self.
And before the break, we were starting to get into that, the psychological impact of neoliberalism.
Right.
It feels like a natural next step after discussing how this logic reshapes our institutions and systems.
Exactly. Brown argues that as this neoliberal rationality becomes ingrained in our society, it starts to affect us on a deeper level. It shapes our values, our beliefs, even our emotions.
So it's not just about the rules of the game changing. It's about how we internalize those rules and start to see the world through a different lens.
Precisely. One of the key points Brown makes is that neoliberalism fosters a culture of intense individualism and competition.
Right.
We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to strive for success,
Yeah.
to optimize ourselves, to be the best version of ourselves.
It's like we're all running on this endless treadmill of self-improvement, always trying to measure up to some external standard.
And this constant pressure to perform can lead to a lot of anxiety and insecurity. We start to see ourselves as human capital, always needing to increase our value in the marketplace.
It makes me think of the rise of social media and how we're constantly comparing ourselves to others,
Right.
curating our online personas to project an image of success and happiness. It's exhausting.
Brown would argue that this is a direct result of neoliberal thinking. We're taught to see ourselves as entrepreneurs of our own lives, responsible for our own success or failure.
Yeah, and that can be a pretty isolating and demoralizing experience, especially when you factor in the systemic inequalities we discussed earlier.
Right.
Not everyone has the same opportunities or resources to succeed in this kind of system.
Absolutely. Brown points out that neoliberalism often masks these systemic issues by framing everything in terms of individual responsibility.
Right.
If you're not succeeding, it's because you're not working hard enough,
Yeah.
not being entrepreneurial enough. It ignores the structural barriers that many people face.
So it creates this illusion of a level playing field while simultaneously reinforcing existing power dynamics.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And this has implications not just for our individual well-being, but also for our collective ability to address social problems.
Because if we're all focused on our own individual success, we're less likely to care about the well-being of others or the common good.
Exactly. Brown argues that this is one of the most dangerous consequences of neoliberalism. It erodes our sense of community and shared responsibility, making it harder to come together to tackle collective challenges like climate change, poverty, or inequality.
It's like we're all trapped in our own little bubbles competing against each other
Yeah.
instead of collaborating to create a better world.
That's a powerful image. And it really gets to the heart of Brown's critique of neoliberalism. She's not just critiquing economic policies, she's questioning a whole worldview, a way of thinking that prioritizes individual gain over collective well-being.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive into Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos. It's definitely challenged me to think differently about the world and my place in it.
I think that's the power of Brown's work. It doesn't offer easy answers, but it pushes us to ask the right questions and to engage in critical reflection about the kind of future we want to create.
And for our listeners out there who are ready to continue this exploration, we highly recommend checking out Brown's book, Undoing the Demos.
Yes.
It's a dense read, but it's well worth the effort.
Absolutely. And remember, the future is not predetermined. It's up to each of us to shape it. So keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the ideas that are shaping our world. Until then, keep exploring.